Hey everyone, welcome to Frame Academy Project 4 Part 3, diving into JavaScript. So this will be a very gentle introduction to JavaScript, and I want to start out by explaining why we even need JavaScript. So as you saw in the previous part, we pulled off this interactivity. We clicked on a sphere and that caused it to expand. And to do that sort of thing, you need JavaScript. Up until now in projects 1, 2, and 3, we've been able to do a lot with HTML, but the experiences are mostly visual and kind of static. There hasn't been a lot to click on. And it's great that we can do so much with HTML, but in order for us to go further, it's time to get our feet wet with JavaScript. So, with JavaScript, you can do all manner of things. You can dynamically update your HTML. You can interact with third-party services. You can create user interfaces, build all sorts of sweet features, all sorts of stuff that responds to user behavior or what have you. Now, we could write our JavaScript in our index.html file, but that's not a great way to do it because before you know it, this HTML file will just be really long and kind of unwieldy, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's better just to write your JavaScript in a separate JavaScript file. Glitch makes it very easy to do this. Just click on this New File button, and you want to give it a file name of public/js/ and then any name you want, and then just make sure you give it an ending of .js that will indicate to the system that it's a JavaScript file, and that's what you want. Now I've gone ahead and put some starter code inside in the starter project. You can see there's a file here, public.js/component starter. So I put this code in here, and in time we're going to understand what all of this is doing, but this will kind of start you off so that you can kind of immediately begin writing some code and seeing the results of it. So I promise we will be able to make sense of this in time, and don't be concerned if it doesn't make sense now. It really shouldn't. Okay, and it's actually in between these brackets here on kind of line 4 or 5 that you'll be writing your first bits of JavaScript. Okay. Now the only thing kind of syntax-wise that you should notice now is that whenever you have curly braces or just regular parentheses, they always end up being closed, right, at some point. If you think about how in your HTML file, you always had to have a closing tag with an opening tag to kind of like round off the HTML element. In JavaScript, every parentheses and every curly braces eventually has to be closed. And in Glitch, if you click on one of them, it'll actually show you, it'll sort of highlight which other sort of kind of braces or parentheses it corresponds to, so you can see them all kind of lining up. Okay. Now in this first line, what we're actually doing is doing what's called registering the component. And this is where you give it a name. And I've named this first component disappear because this is what this component is going to do. It's going to make it so when you put this component on something, if you click on it, it will disappear. So it's always good practice just to name your component in a way that kind of reflects what it does often. So I'm just going to name it disappear. Now, once you name your component, notice that if you ever want to rename your file in Glitch, you can select it, click this drop-down arrow, and then rename, right? So you could rename it disappear.js, public/js/disappear.js, and that might make sense. Now in this third line, this init, what is this funky looking thing, init? So init is just short for initialize, and initialize is just a fancy word for load. And what this init function does is it says any code you put inside of these curly braces, it will run as soon as your component loads or initializes. So this is good for our component, and that's why we're going to be writing our code inside of this init function. Okay, without further ado, let's actually start writing some JavaScript. So the first thing we're going to do is make some variables. Now, JavaScript variables are one of the kind of building blocks of the language, and they're super important. And a variable is just sort of like a container for different kinds of data or information. And if you've done algebra, you actually might be familiar with this concept of a variable, right? When you solve an equation that's like x plus 6 equals 11, and you're solving for x, you're trying to figure out what that variable is, right? X represents something else. And that's what a JavaScript variable is too. It's a container that can hold other information. It could be a number, like 6, but it could also be other things, like a string. A string is a bunch of characters, like text. It could also be something like one of your HTML elements you could store inside of a variable. So you can store a number of different things. And for now, we're going to start with some simple ones like number and string. Now, there are a few ways to define a variable and give it a value. For now, we're going to use the let keyword. So go ahead and write down let, and then give your variable a name. I'm going to name this one my number, and then you say equals, and then you assign it a value, whatever value you want. I'm going to say 6. So just with this one line of code, we've defined a variable, we've called it my number, and we've assigned it a value of 6. And I want to make another variable now. I'm going to put a semicolon, which is it's not something that's actually needed in the language JavaScript, but I've sort of gotten used to using it, and some people recommend using it just after you define a variable or sometimes define certain kinds of functions. So that's why you see this semicolon after my 6 here. Now, if you were to just define more variables right on this line, you would actually need the semicolon. But if you're going to throw it on the next line, it's not required. But I use it anyway. Okay, for this second variable, I'm going to go ahead and make a string. I'm going to call it my string equals, and then strings need to be in quotes. Okay, so I'm going to make this string my component is awesome. Okay, and another semicolon. Okay, so there we have it. Now, I want to make sure that we've set up our variables the right way. And to test this, I'm going to use something that you might remember from a previous project. We even hit it in project 1. It's called the JavaScript console, the browser console. If you remember, if you open up a page, your WebXR site, you can press Control-Shift-I to pull up this browser console. And we used it before to check for any errors, right? If your code had some errors in it that the browser detected, it would throw those errors here, and you'd see them with an angry red mark. But you can actually use JavaScript to write to this console, like little messages that are called logs. And this is the first kind of simple thing that our component is going to do. We're just going to log our variables to the console so we can see if we have set them up right. The way to log something to the console is with a simple little function called console.log and then parentheses. And whatever you put in these parentheses will get logged to the console. So what I want to log is my number to see if it has a value of 6 as I've tried to set it as. So we're going to log that variable, and we're also going to log my string to see if our string shows up as we've defined it. Okay, now if you were to check now and you refreshed, you might be thinking, well, you still wouldn't see it, right, in the console log. The variable still wouldn't show up. And the reason for that is we haven't actually brought the component, we haven't imported that JavaScript file into our HTML. If you remember when we used the animation component and things like that, we had to import it as a script inside of our head element. Okay. Now I've written out the component I wrote out before in this disappear.js component, and if you look at the bottom of this project, by the way, you can see I updated the starter project with all of this code in it, so you can check it out. But once we did that, we made the file, we still have to import it, right? So that's why inside of my head, you can see script source equals public/js/disappear.js, right? It's the file with our component in it. Okay, and then once we've done that, there's just one final step, and that's actually attaching the component to an entity. If you think about other components we've used before, like position, rotation, animation, they work as soon as you put them on an entity. So we still have to put our disappear component on an entity in order for it to run. And in this case, I'm just going to drop it right on the scene entity itself. So if you remember, the way you put a component on an entity is to use the name of the component as an HTML attribute. So I just put disappear right here on the scene. Now, if you go ahead and refresh your WebXR site, press Control-Shift-I, and you can actually see here in the log, we've got 5, and we also have my component is going to be awesome. Okay. And the console actually shows you where in your code this log is coming from. It says disappear.js. It says it's in this file, line 7. And this one is in the same file, disappear.js, line 8. Okay. Now, I know that our component doesn't yet do what we want it to, which is, you click on something and then that thing disappears. But we've actually gone over quite a lot of important kind of groundwork already. So you've learned how to make a new JavaScript file in Glitch. You've learned how to register and name a component. And you've learned a little bit about this init function, which is where you can put code that will just run as soon as the component loads or initializes. You've learned a little bit about variables and how to define them and give them a value. We've done a variable with a number and a variable with a string. And you've learned about console.log, which lets you log stuff to the browser console. Then finally, we've imported our JavaScript file into our HTML document, and we've also attached our new component named disappear to the scene entity, which will cause that code to work when you refresh your page. Okay, I hope you managed to get through that. For the challenge, what I'd like you to do is actually do something very similar, right? Use a component to just log some variables to the console. You don't need to use my exact variables, right? Change up the values of these if you want, and then go ahead and see if you can, make your new file, import it into here, define your variables the right way, log them the right way, and then make sure you've done it the right way by simply loading your page and making sure that you see the value here in the console. Okay, good luck. Next time we will actually get to disappearing, which is where we know we want this component to get to. But I will see you in part 4.